All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Almushaikeh. I'm a PhD student in applied physics and a board member at Student for Sustainability. I'm very excited to welcome you to the first sustainability seminar of this semester. This seminar series was started in March 2020 with support from the Office of Sustainability. Our goal is to create a platform that raises awareness about important sustainability topics. Today, we will explore how voluntary carbon markets can drive the next generation of sustainability breakthroughs and help support the Saudi vision. For example, one of the Saudi Green Initiative aims to reduce carbon emissions by 278 million tons each year. Our speaker today is Julie Brown. Julie leads strategic advisory solutions at the Voluntary Carbon Market Company. It's a carbon credit company established by the Saudi Public Investment Fund and the Saudi Tadawul Group. She works with partners across the carbon market ecosystem to scale, decarbonize, and grow sustainably. Julie brings over a decade of experience in sustainable development. She has managed programs in East Africa and Central America that improves access to clean energy, save water, and natural resources for millions of people. Her expertise includes carbon projects development, markets readiness, and decarbonization strategy, all grounded in a strong commitment to community-centered climate action. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, Julie. We're very thrilled to have you here today. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. I think if I speak like this, can you hear me in the back? For the Zoom, okay. It's really such an honor to be here at KAUST. I've just been blown away with my short visit so far of the kindness, the innovation happening here, and really feel privileged to speak to you all today. So first, we're going to try to cover 4 things in this conversation today. First, I'm going to give a very brief introduction on how do the voluntary carbon markets function. Then we're going to do a deep dive into one of the aspects of the carbon market that I find the most interesting, carbon removals. We see a lot of innovation happening in this space, and I also see a lot of projects within the KAUST community that fall into this bucket. Next, going to ask some questions of, with the information we share today, how can this apply to your work, to your academic research? There's questions on how we can use the carbon markets to bring first-of-a-kind technologies to scale. There's also questions of how can carbon finance be used as a form of international development, of getting resources into the hands of the communities that have contributed the least to climate change, but will be some of the most impacted. And then finally, I'll give some information on our company, the Voluntary Carbon Market Company, wrap up and open for question and answer. So first, a bit about me. I've been working in the voluntary carbon market space for about the last decade in programs spanning East Africa, have also worked in Central America, and am very committed and dedicated to this industry. I'm also joined here today by my colleague Sultan. Sultan can raise his hand. So if there are any questions afterwards as well, he is also an expert in this space. But first, Voluntary Carbon Markets 101. So first, to set the stage, all of us know that this is to be true, of no one is immune for how the climate crisis is reshaping our world. That we see here within Saudi Arabia, with current amounts of warming, by 2100, temperatures are expected to rise by 5.6 degrees Celsius. Imagine days that are already hot, 40 degrees, 45 degrees Celsius, adding on 5 degrees more. We also see heat waves are expected to be over 4,000% longer within the region. We know there are challenges with biodiversity, with water scarcity. And I also wanted to share here of course, not only is this a challenge within Saudi Arabia, but we also see that this is a global issue. So this picture of a fire is actually from my home state of California. When I was 12 years old, we had a week off of school, not from snow, but because of fire. So this was the witch fire that occurred very close to my house. And we had flames coming above the mountain that were about 30 meters in height of just fire. So we see if around the world, all of us are impacted by climate change, and we urgently need solutions. The one such solution is a voluntary carbon market mechanism. So this is a very brief overview. How does this work? What is a voluntary carbon credit? A voluntary carbon credit is 1 ton of carbon emissions that are either avoided or removed that is certified by a third-party agency. So here's a little bit of an example of how this process works. Is first of, we have an example here of, here's a factory, and then this tree is a carbon project developer, so a supplier. So we know that a factory, we always recommend, take as much action as you can to reduce your emissions. Like even when a factory does that, there's going to be a certain amount of emissions that are hard to abate. And that's where we recommend if a carbon project developer has an environmental project. It can be a wide range of initiatives from mangroves to improved cook stoves. That in this example, this is a carbon project developer that's planting trees. That action removes carbon from the atmosphere. And then that carbon credit is purchased by the company to be used in their own carbon accounting. So we see right now the voluntary carbon market mechanism. What are carbon credits being used for? Of companies and individuals that are voluntarily taking action and responsibility for their carbon emissions and essentially investing in environmental initiatives that wouldn't have occurred without climate finance. And so here are 3 different examples of what are voluntary carbon projects. That just to make things simple, I've put things in 3 different buckets. The first kind of voluntary carbon project is we're looking at carbon reduction credits. So these are initiatives, an example I often give is if you have diesel vehicles that are being used by a company, you replace those with electric vehicles, you're reducing the amount of carbon that's being released by those vehicles. That's a reduction credit. The next kind of credit is nature-based removals. So those are using processes of the natural world to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So these are mangroves, tree planting initiatives, and then we have carbon direct removals. Carbon direct removals or engineered removals is a kind of carbon credit where we're using a kind of engineered technology like biochar, direct air capture, enhanced rock weathering to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And to bring this home, here's 3 different examples of what these projects look like within Saudi Arabia. So first, carbon direct removals. We know that Aramco has a pilot direct air capture facility right now that's working and is capable of extracting 12 tons of CO2 per year. So we see that kind of engineered machine. Nature-based removals, we're looking at mangroves. So mangroves, planting mangroves are sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. And then we have reduction projects. So an example of reduction projects in Saudi Arabia, we're actually looking at initiatives that are recycling materials and are reducing the amount of carbon, avoiding the amount of carbon that would have otherwise been emitted into the atmosphere. And here's a little bit of an overview of some of what we're seeing of trends in the voluntary carbon market right now. So starting with nature-based reduction, nature-based reduction is a project I didn't go over before, but these are initiatives of working with communities that live around forests or mangroves, giving them other opportunities of REDD+ projects of forms of income where they're no longer engaging in those acts of deforestation. So we see nature-based reductions. Nature-based removals are particularly interesting. So this is the type of project, planting trees, planting mangroves, that at the beginning of this year, and I'll go in a little bit later into the presentation, These credits were trading at $17 a ton in the voluntary carbon market. Now we see these credits in a period of about 6 months have increased to $34 a ton. Then we have tech-based reduction. I'd say prices that we're currently seeing in the market right now is usually in the range of $3 to $5 a ton. But if there's better measurement to see how much carbon are we actually removing, if there's more integrity, we do see that prices are higher. So these are projects like renewable energy, clean cook stoves. And then the last bucket, the tech-based removals. And this is a really interesting sector that already in the beginning of this year, we've seen biochar prices. Before at the beginning of the year was $140 a ton. Now it's going up to $180 a ton. And we're seeing more companies are interested in seeing how they can get more nature-based removal credits and durable removal credits. And we're even seeing durable removal credits being incorporated into standards like SBTi. And we're seeing for durable removal credits that supply demand is exceeding supply by a ratio of 10 to 1. And we see if carbon markets are a tool to help companies get to net zero. So what we see on this graph is we're modeling out the emissions as an example company for how much emissions a company currently has and what is their pathway to get to net zero by 2050. So if you look at those bars in the dark blue, you're saying what is a company's current emissions to date? And then the emissions in green, we always recommend how can an organization first reduce their emissions and then start to use carbon offsets. So we're seeing here that curve in the blue, we're seeing companies that are using carbon removals. So each year we recommend if companies are saying, how can they start to reduce their carbon emissions over time and increase the percentage of removal credits that they're buying per the Oxford offsetting principles. And then here's another graph that shows of how buyers can use carbon credits to compensate for their own emissions. So we're looking in that dark blue. Those are the emissions that a company is having today. And then we see of companies using a mix per Oxford offsetting principles. The credits in green are reduction credits or carbon avoidance, and the credits in blue are carbon removals. So this is one pathway that companies can use to reach net zero. And we're even seeing some companies are setting what I think are very exciting examples. When we look at organizations like Microsoft are saying, let's not only reach net zero, let's reach net negative. So organizations like Microsoft do all that they can to reduce their emissions, and then they start investing in carbon removal projects to see can they remove more carbon from the atmosphere each year than what they actually emit as an organization. And here's a little bit of the history of the carbon markets pathway. I'm going to go into a very high level overview, very simplified. But I think this is important to set the stage of how we see the carbon markets in effect today. So at COP3 was when countries started to discuss how are we going to reduce our carbon emissions globally. And a really interesting debate came out of COP3, where we had all countries in the room, and the developed nations were saying that we should all take action for our carbon emissions, and we should all set targets to reduce our carbon emissions. But then the developing countries in the world said that's not fair. You developed Western countries, you've made your wealth out of emitting this carbon into the atmosphere. You've had your industrial revolutions. We haven't had that. And so a compromise was brokered at that COP, where countries said, if we do understand your logic for this, and the compromise that was brokered was by December 31st, 2020, of developed countries were going to take responsibility for their carbon emissions and their nationally determined contributions. And developing countries would not be forced to do this until we've entered a post-Paris world. So now what we're seeing is happening, but of course this is a huge global endeavor, is we're seeing all countries around the world are now starting their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions. So they're making accounting ledgers of all of the carbon emissions happening within their country. And they're saying, how can they reach their targets that are set by their countries? But we also saw something that emerged out of this was for COP3 of creating the organization, the UNFCCC, where this was a mechanism under the UN that allowed countries to register carbon projects that were then purchased by other countries. Now we're looking at an Article 6 trading mechanism where countries are entering into bilateral trading agreements because we know a country, for example, like Singapore, is a small island nation state where it's going to be hard for a country like Singapore to be able to have rainforest projects, mangrove projects, and they're able to work with other countries that have those initiatives as a form of climate finance and is also being seen as a form of international development finance as well. Great. That was a quick background on the history of the voluntary carbon markets. Now here are a few trends that we see happening in the market. So first, we're seeing that companies want high integrity credits and a higher percentage of removals per Oxford offsetting principles. Something that's really interesting in the market, when we see a project have an integrity rating, the price of the credit increases by about 40% for every increase in integrity, for every increase in rating. Something else that we're also seeing in this market is prices of nature-based removal credits and durable removal credits are increasing while supply is limited. And something that I think is especially interesting to talk about today with this brilliant group at KAUST is Saudi companies want to support Saudi projects, but supply is very limited. We see of Saudi companies would even be interested sometimes in paying a premium for Saudi projects, but very few Saudi projects are on the market. And here's just a few examples of, we've been speaking more of the theoretical, but how are companies using carbon credits today? This is an example of Total Energies. Total has a goal of reaching net zero by 2050. So working on measuring their emissions across scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, investing in renewables, seeing how they can invest in carbon removal projects as well, and how they can reduce their carbon intensity over time. We're also seeing another example of Bain & Company is an organization of all of their emissions. They had about 180,000 tons of emissions last year, and were fully offset with removal credits of both nature-based removals and durable removals. So here we're seeing if Bain is following best practices, saying how can they reduce their emissions as an organization? And then for the emissions that are left, how can they use high integrity, high quality offsets? And here's another example. So we've been speaking a bit more about the voluntary market, but we're also seeing compliance market measures emerging. So Singapore is working with many different countries around the globe, entering into bilateral agreements with countries like Chile, like Ghana, and seeing Singapore is planning on putting a carbon tax on businesses. So businesses are now incentivized. How do we reduce our carbon emissions so we don't pay this tax? And we understand that the tax that we do pay is going to be significant and will increase over time. So they're working with other host countries, strengthening their diplomatic relations to invest in projects around the world. And now the time for some of the big questions that this conversation brings up is, what does this mean for this room today? How can you innovate, contribute, and lead in this conversation? So something I find really fascinating in this space is to be on track to 1.5 degrees Celsius world. We need between 5 to 10 billion tons of carbon removals by 2030. Right now, one of the leading carbon registries for carbon removal technologies, Puro Earth, has only had 1.6 million tons of issuance to date. So we see where we are to where we need to be. There's a huge gap. But we see, especially for carbon removal technologies, and this is probably one of the questions that I'd open up to this group today, is there's a few different things that we need to consider that I would put into two different buckets. The first bucket is how do we have the right standards and methodologies for these innovative durable removal projects that we feel has high integrity and high credibility. That we know there's technologies like ocean upwelling. We know microalgae that's being put into the ocean to remove carbon. How can we agree that that's a high integrity credit? And then the other side, so we have the technical aspect of how are we designing these projects, designing these scientific methodologies. Then on the other side of that is how do we make the business cases for this to work? I personally have a hypothesis that in the durable carbon removal industry, if we get down to a price of $50 per ton, we're able to unlock this for a lot of companies to start investing in these technologies more. So how do we create the right business models to be able to produce durable removal credits at scale? And I think something we see is the need to innovate both the technology and to innovate the scientific methodologies behind this. So here are some examples of different removal projects. We have afforestation, direct air capture, biochar. There are also interesting marine carbon dioxide technologies, enhanced rock weathering. And we see if permanence is high, co-benefits rank well, there's scalability of these initiatives, but the MRV complexity. The one aspect of a voluntary carbon credit is when you buy a ton, how do we know a ton is actually a ton? So the MRV complexity is also the science and technology behind that of how do we make sure that we're monitoring, reporting, and verifying all of these credits with integrity. And I think here to innovate, contribute, lead in the sector of, for me, this is one of the biggest challenges of our time, that we need to design the methodologies, the scientific rule books for these credits to be produced. We need to make the business models. In some cases, we need to see how are we doing carbon accounting for entire countries? How can we best use climate finance as a tool of international development for people in extreme poverty that need this the most? So these are all the questions, and I'm sure we can speak a bit more about this in the question and answer. But I see this, we're really in a pivotal moment for the voluntary carbon market, and then how compliance market mechanisms are going to be adapted globally. And I think this is a list of really fascinating questions for all of us to be thinking about within this room. And going through some of the other questions as well of the different solutions that can be developed of how do we permanently remove carbon from the atmosphere? How do we have solutions that we know for 100 plus years, 1,000 plus years will lock away carbon? How do we ensure transparency, accountability, and trust in this market mechanism? How do we balance environmental integrity with economic viability? And how do we empower communities and avoid unintended harm? And here's a little bit more about us as an organization and what we're trying to build within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So we know of climate emissions. This is a very strategic topic for the KSA, which is one of the largest 10 greenhouse gas emitters globally, but is also taking significant action for this challenge. That we see innovations like the Saudi Green Initiative, we see the 2030 NDCs being updated, pledging to reach net zero as a country by 2060, seeing how we reduce methane emissions, and then having organizations like KAUST of saying, how do we make these innovations for a green tomorrow? A little bit about our company. The Voluntary Carbon Market Company was set up to support global climate mitigation efforts from Saudi Arabia. So we're a joint venture between PIF and Tadawul. We're 80% owned by PIF, 20% owned by Tadawul. We were announced by His Royal Highness Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in September of 2021. And we've been established to be a voluntary carbon market mechanism within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Actually, a fun fact about our organization is we're the second registered exchange within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia after Tadawul. And what's our ambition as an organization? Our ambition is to be a globally leading voluntary carbon market. We have 3 business lines. So first, we help companies with our exchange and trading services. Then we have our advisory services that I lead with our team. Our advisory services primarily do 2 things. 1, we help companies to register their own voluntary carbon projects within the kingdom. And 2, we also help companies with their decarbonization journey. So understanding what are their greenhouse gas emissions, how can they work on decarbonization projects that will both reduce cost and carbon. And then we're also working on our investment services that we expect to come live come 2026. And here's a bit of our history as an organization. And really, thanks to our partners, we've been able to build a strong ecosystem. So part of our organization, we've been well known for having the largest auctions of voluntary carbon credits in the world. So our first auction event was in 2022 at FII in Riyadh, where we auctioned off 1.4 million tons of credits. That was the world record for the largest auction of voluntary carbon credits in history. Then in 2023, we beat our own record, and we had an auction event in Nairobi, Kenya, of 2.2 million tons. And then we had an auction event in Baku in Azerbaijan at COP29, where we auctioned off close to 2.6 million tons of carbon credits. And we also launched our exchange. Now in 2025, having the exchange platform, we've already sold over 4 million tons of carbon credits to date. We've also had a really exciting announcement with ANOA, where we have a forward offtake agreement for 30 million tons of carbon credits that will be supplied to ANOA until 2030. This is one of the largest agreements announced globally for voluntary carbon credits. So not only is this leadership within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but this is leadership on a global stage. Here's a little bit more about the agreement with ANOA and VCM. ANOA has taken a great stance in this agreement, where ANOA is responsible for providing renewable energy to NEOM. But that's going to be a period of transition. So to take responsibility for their carbon emissions, we've partnered with ANOA to be able to get them access to carbon offsets to be able to reach carbon neutrality. And here's a bit about our partners. We're incredibly grateful for our partner organizations. We have over 30 large companies that are a part of our exchange. I'm sure many of these logos are recognized by the group in this room. And these companies, when we think about the scale, These companies are responsible for over 40% of emissions within KSA. So we're giving these companies a pathway where they can invest in environmental projects to take responsibility for their carbon emissions through carbon offsets. And we're also seeing even outside of KSA, we're seeing large international companies also come to our exchange, which is very exciting because when we saw voluntary carbon credit trading globally, the hubs are London or Singapore. Now we're bringing that trading to Riyadh. And here of my humble words of wisdom to this group and all of the very exciting innovations happening in this room. This is one of my favorite quotes by Steve Jobs of you have two essential tasks in your life. One is to figure out what your purpose is, and the second is to take action on it. Everything else is just detail. So that's what I'll leave you with as you consider some of these challenges that we've spoken about today. And I thank you for your time and open the room for any questions. Thank you so much.
If you have any questions on Zoom or in person, please raise your hand. Yes.
Thanks, Julie. There's an awful lot there for half an hour talk. Brilliant summary. I'm Damien Jenkins. I work for Beacon, the consulting arm of KAUST. Two questions, really. In terms of the Saudi market, you mentioned some very large numbers of auctions there. How much of that has come from, or has any of it come from Saudi projects in terms of your auction portfolio? And what quantum of credit has been generated in the kingdom at the moment?
That's a great question. And that's something that I'm very passionate about, and we're very passionate about as an organization. In our current auction events, we haven't been able to include any Saudi projects because they haven't been available on the market. But we hope sincerely that this will change over time. And this is something that we see with the advisory function that I lead, is helping there's probably 20, 30 different initiatives within the kingdom that we have carbon projects that are under development, but they're still quite in the early stages. And something that's challenging about carbon project development is it usually takes anywhere from 12 to 18 months to register a project. So we're in those conversations now, and we do hope to have more Saudi projects moving forward. But probably the range of credits that have been issued, based on the data that I've seen, I would estimate this is probably in the range of 200 to 300,000 credits within Saudi. And we also see the IREX mechanism about 300,000 IREX as well.
And just my next question you've kind of addressed. So we've got a large scale algae project at KAUST. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, and that's hugely positive. But also we've got one very large, potentially scalable project with a key client of ours who's looking to develop a credits program. So in terms of bringing projects to you, what's the mechanism for that?
The algae project, we've been in conversations. We find that very exciting. There's a few different mechanisms that we can use when we think about algae. One is the reduction project I mentioned of if you have a baseline of how much carbon is in typical animal feed, and then the project change of putting algae in animal feed, what are those carbon reductions? And then there is opportunity for biochar, or even looking of, can we use the algae to apply carbon to soils and store carbon in that way? But then the other project you said?
I think I'd like to discuss that with you offline.
We'll discuss offline. But I think we're so encouraged by the innovation happening in KAUST. And I think what I would most want to leave you with about the voluntary carbon market is especially when we think about innovation, first of a kind technologies, this is a great market mechanism that can support those projects to scale.
Thank you, Julie, and all the VCM team back in Riyadh. Really great effort. My question to you is, you mentioned tech-based removals are trading between $50 to $300. And we know that for it to be viable, it needs to at least hit the $500, $600. But how do you see the gap is closing, or how are we going to reach that?
I think when I said carbon durable removals, I meant everything from biochar, enhanced rock weathering, and then we also see of CCUS projects, direct air capture. We see all of those projects are trading at different price points. So biochar right now is more in the range of $180 a ton, enhanced rock weathering $330 a ton, while direct air capture, I would say anywhere from $600 to $1,200 plus per ton. So of course, it really depends on the buyer of like something that we've seen of the Climeworks direct air capture facility in Iceland. Microsoft has been a huge proponent of the work happening there and what the buyer sees as a value for those credits.
So, so you mentioned Microsoft buying from Climeworks. So this the 600 to 1,000 covers everything from capture to permanently storage. So is it? So my question basically is it economically viable to sell at this price?
I think that really depends on a project by project basis.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Very, very clear talk. Coming back to methodology and a little bit what we were discussing this morning, right? So if I think of atmospheric CO2 capture, right? The methodology, you are obviously going to use renewable energy to capture CO2 from the atmosphere, and you are going to use a huge lot of it, right? But the methodology only seems to consider the carbon that is captured, not the fact that that clean energy could be used to actually avoid much more carbon dioxide in other type of credits. Do you see the future developing methodologies that are actually more aligned with the objective of having as much CO2 capture as possible, rather than looking into the type of technology that does that?
I think what we see, and something that's interesting of talking about direct air capture projects as well, recently there's been a lot of headlines of looking at the biogenic emissions of how much carbon does it take to construct a direct air capture facility. And some people are even saying if we're buying credits with integrity, all of that carbon needs to be factored in before we start producing carbon credits. So I think all of our methodologies have been written with the best of intentions, but there's a constant evolution to see how are we being conservative, how can we have more integrity within this space. So especially if your point about the renewable energy, I think we want to see if every baseline environment that we are taking the most conservative measures, conservative but realistic, to make sure that we're not overcounting.
Here is Abdullah asking if in Saudi Arabia, the backbone of
Use the microphone with me. Oh, okay. No worries. Okay. In Saudi Arabia, the backbone of the economy is the oil and gas industry. which is known to have a difficulty in integrating carbon capture technologies. How does VCM plan to help implement carbon capture and storage technologies in these industries? That's a great question. And I think actually surprisingly, when we look at carbon capture utilization and storage, some of the technologies to store carbon of just in a very simplified level of oil and gas in some ways actually has the perfect infrastructure to be able to take carbon and put that back down in the geologic wells. So we do see of carbon capture projects of Aramco pioneering this, Occidental Oil within the US, there are some very interesting synergies, but we need to continue to develop that technology.
Thank you very much. My question is about secondary markets for carbon credits, and how developed are they, and are they operating here in Saudi Arabia? Because one hypothesis I had for why there's a premium for these really high quality credits is that it might be relatively cheap to produce these high quality credits now. And if you get a bunch of them and there's a secondary market, then you can sell them for a higher price in the future, essentially. And I also wondered that with about Bain, because Bain is a hedge fund, so they may find it advantageous to think about that angle.
Do you mean secondary markets like investing in futures?
Well, both futures, but also, where you can basically just sell the credits, buy and sell the credits back and forth, basically.
We see a big market in trading credits. That I've seen some data that says the average voluntary carbon credit is actually traded 7 times in its lifetime before it's retired. And we do see that there are some companies that have strategies where, like, we saw that jump in price of nature-based removals, where companies will invest in credits, hold on to them, and then when they see that increase in price, will then sell the credits in the market.
Hussein Al Yusuf is asking if there are any companies that implemented solutions for carbon capture in Saudi, and what are these technologies besides the first DAC?
That's a great question. There's a lot of interesting developments that are happening today. To my understanding, I'm aware of 2 direct air capture projects, one of that Aramco is implementing, and there's actually a Californian company that is in the process of installing a pilot unit in Riyadh. But I'm not aware of any other technologies at this to date, but we see this as quite an innovative field, and new technologies are being developed all the time.
Just a note from the Office of Sustainability and the work we are doing, and thank you, Jorge, to introduce us to Julie. So why Julie is also here, because it's a great topic for all of us, but most important in the pathway we are going now this year on defining the climate action plan for KAUST. So we are doing our greenhouse gas emission inventories, and we're also looking for the pathways for decarbonization. So on that in mind, and looking for the scope 3 emissions, which are the most complicated to tackle, we are looking for the potential for KAUST as an institution have some sort of carbon removal mechanism. So the algae project, the cryogenic carbon capture, the biochar, we are exploring all the options at this stage. What are the potential for KAUST to have a revenue from that and to benefit from our own research? So that's a small context. So the office is here to support and to make sure that the pathway to Julie is clear, and we can all work together on that. Thank you. Bill?
Julie, thank you. I have one question in terms of double accounting, which is something that I still quite don't understand in terms of remits of these credits. So let's imagine that I'm a company in one country like this, and I buy a credit that from a project on another country, but then the countries also need to report their determined contributions. If I'm a company in Saudi and I bought a credit from Kenya, when Kenya is going to report their carbon emissions, will that local offset count for them or count for my Saudi country where my company is based in?
That's a great question. I would answer that in two ways. One, I think within the voluntary carbon market mechanism, if that was a credit on Vera and you're retiring it, there isn't a possible way to count that credit twice. But I think what we're saying of being in a post-Paris world is it's already complicated to make a greenhouse gas inventory for a university, for a company. To make it for an entire country is a hugely complex endeavor. And so I think what we're saying is ideally with Article 6, if you're buying that credit from Kenya, that should be removed from Kenya's NDC and then added as a benefit to the NDC of Saudi. But developing those mechanisms, we're still in the very early stages of that happening.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for the nice presentation. Just I have one question. So you are licensed to trade, which is really nice. The question is, what is the challenges that you envision to register, to create the registry for carbon credit in Saudi Arabia? Trading is an important issue, no question about that. But the question is the more significant or important for Saudi Arabia to create the carbon registry, to be able to register the carbon. This is question number one. Question number two, you mentioned early on Kyoto and then how we reach out Paris Agreement, discussion always between the North and the South. I'm really amused by, for example, you organize the biggest auction ever, but why this is still not recognized by the North? Why always we are claimed in the South that we are fossil fuel country? It's not, when all the meetings that I attended with UNFCCC, IPCC, this is not recognized. Is it a lack of maybe communication, maybe not embed this auction or the details of it in academic literature, because IPCC or other, they don't, of course, use gray literature. We don't care what New York Times say or Washington Post say. We care about the academic journal. So KAUST can contribute in this, making sure this is reach the academic literature. Thank you.
Those are great questions. I think, so for your first question, we actually do have a registry within Saudi of GCOM, managed by the Ministry of Energy. There are 5 different methodologies under that, but I think all registries of getting those first initial projects registered, seen with integrity, tends to be a challenge worldwide. So, but GCOM does accept projects also under Vera and Gold Standard. And we see about 90% of the credits produced globally are on Vera and Gold Standard. So we also have access to that mechanism for projects within Saudi. Global climate leadership I think we are actually seeing a little bit of the change of tides of having partners like NOAA that have committed to buying 30 million tons of carbon credits, when even when we look at companies like Microsoft, of some of their largest single deals announced to date are in the range of 8 to 12 million tons. But Microsoft is a huge leader in carbon durable removals. So I think the recognition internationally of just by continuing to be committed to high integrity credits, committed to the work of having partners of leading companies that are taking very innovative, high integrity strategies, I think over time of having that consistency will be recognized.
Abdullah is following up on the question. So does VCM only focus on the carbon credit initiatives, or does it also provide technical solutions to their partners?
So our 2 business lines, we have the exchange and trading services. So that's live within the kingdom to allow companies to buy and sell voluntary carbon credits. With our advisory services, what we do is we're able to advise on both of how to register a carbon credit project, of helping with feasibility assessments, of working on writing project design documents, the PDD, that's kind of the rule book that guides the project. And we also help companies with decarbonization. So I think for that question of, we're really happy to see of how we can support technically with project development through our advisory arm.
Hello, thank you very much for the information you shared today. A lot of good new information. But I wanted to ask something you at least follow up from what you just said. The last line of the work or the services you provide. Can you share anything about the investment services or what that will entail? Or is it too soon to know? Thank you.
That's a great question. And our investment line is being launched come 2026. But I think our goal as a company is we want to invest more within Saudi. So we're seeing of what are the right kinds of investment mechanisms that we can make to support more carbon project development within the kingdom.
One more time, thank you so much for your excellent talk. We really appreciate it. If you have any questions, please stay. We will have an offline conversation with Julie for about 30 minutes to 1 hour. Thank you so much for coming. And keep an eye on Students for Sustainability. We're going to have a lot of events and seminars this semester. We hope to see you all soon. Thank you so much.